What's up, everybody? Welcome back to... Oh, no, that's Nuclear Barbarians. Welcome back to Decouple. 3, 2, 1, all that stuff I usually do. Emmett, it is wonderful having you back. It's been far too long. Thank you for making the digital pilgrimage.
I feel like I should be introducing you, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chris Kiefer, the Maple Leaf Kid, the Canadian Conqueror, the man who is so large and in charge that if you walk in on him with your with your wife, you shut the lights off and apologize. How is it going, dude? Canada has flipped. It must feel great.
I need you as my hype man. The crazy thing, Emmett, is that
rumble, young man, rumble.
We have never met in the 3 dimensions. That's going to change. I think we're both going to the Breakthrough Dialogues.
That's right.
So I'm really excited for that. But you know, enough of this banter, which is always fun for us and probably a little boring for the guests. maybe with the exception of the kind of enthusiasm you're bringing here. I love it. But Emmett, you have been on the podcast, but it's been a while. You are the host of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast. You're a really prolific writer, commentary. I'm going to just say it. I think you're an intellectual, bro.
Thank you.
And in terms of, having this hearkening back like hundreds of years to a classical education where people like read and studied Greek and Latin and the classics. I don't know if you read Greek or Latin, but you certainly have this kind of basis in classical history, classical literature. And what I find fascinating about your writing is I think it brings these layers to it without it going over anybody's head. So huge props on what you do. Just give us like the Coles notes and the latest things you've been up to. And then we are going to dive into the topic of this podcast, how to blow up a pipeline. We're not talking about Nord Stream. We're not talking Seymour Cy Hirsch here. We got something much more weird and wonderful and wild for you. But first off, Emmett, just give us a quick little update on what's new in Emmet Penny land.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still the editor-in-chief of Grid Brief, so if people want curated daily energy news for free, they can go sign up there at gridbrief.com. As you said, I'm at the Nuclear Barbarians Substack. That should be easy to find. You can find all this stuff on my website, emmetpenny.com. I'm a contributing editor at Compact Magazine, and that's where I published this piece that we're about to talk about. So that's pretty much what's going on with me.
Right on. So indeed, this piece, we had talked in the past about doing an episode on this thinker, Andreas Malm, who is, I'm not sure if he's in the humanities, I would guess, given...
He's in a very unrigorous subfield of geography, which is, I think, part of what has allowed him to rise to the top and stand out, is that there just really aren't a lot of barriers because there's not, at least this is what I heard from a geographer friend. So,
yeah. So we talked about covering this guy's thoughts. I think it was an article in which he was saying that the ideal political system to respond to climate change was actually war communism, hearkening back to the very early days of the Russian Revolution, extreme rationing, extreme direction of the means of production. Not a beautiful time from my weak grasp of history. And I asked you to come on and talk about it, and you were like, "Listen, like I don't even want to put any wood on the fire here. I don't want to light a candle in that dark echo chamber. So let's just let it go." And, I was a bit disappointed because I have a weird fascination with it. We both have a bit of a background on the political left. And I'm still intrigued by what's happening over there as I watch it distort itself and alienate itself further and further. I tweeted today about just thinking about, Marx's theories of alienation. Alienation from the products, alienation from maybe not liking to work, with a machine and the machine imposing itself on how you work. But now it's like the left is just alienated from production entirely. As it's jumped ship from the factory floor to the academy, to the lecture hall. So anyway, I think we are kind of forced to now engage with Andreas Malm and his ilk. Because inspired by his same titled book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, we now have a major motion picture. I'm not sure how well it's doing at the box office, but you watched it and wrote a brilliant review of it. I have been trying to stream that thing everywhere. I couldn't find it. I've had a lot of stuff going on personally. Haven't been able to go to the movie theater to watch it. So anyway, we're going to talk about your review, and maybe it's a good thing I haven't watched it because I won't bring such strong opinions to it. But let's jump on in. Maybe just give us an overview of what this movie is about. Not Nord Stream.
So the movie's called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. It is premised on a sort of apologia for eco-terrorism that Andreas Malm wrote a couple years ago of the same title. For some reason, he seems to think in the book that if there's enough like stochastic sabotage against the fossil fuel industry, that it will make the price of oil untenably high and also dissuade people from investing in it. And so that should be sort of like the terroristic vanguard for eco-Leninism, I guess. And the main woman who plays a character, Xochitl, in this, read the book with, I think, the director, whose last name is Goldhaber, like deep in the quarantine parts of COVID, and they decided to write this movie about a sort of motley crew of people that all get together to blow up a pipeline in the Permian Basin for their own reasons, to sort of like literalize what Malm was gesturing towards. And just to sort of like give people might be wondering like, oh, how was this book by Malm received? And I mean, he got, I think, a very flattering interview in the New Yorker with it. I think Ezra Klein even spoke highly of this book. So it ended up getting way more due than I expected. I think part of that also has to do with the fact that this discussion was happening around 2020, the summer of 2020 in America, where NPR was also favorably reviewing books called In Defense of Looting. And there seemed to be like an overall agreement that the rule of law didn't really matter if you had the right feelings inside your heart. And so I think, maybe people have some like buyer's remorse now, having come out of that like fever dream of a year or a couple years. But I haven't seen it, if that's true, based on the other reviews I've read, which seem to be like both aesthetically and morally very on board with what the film has to offer. And so the premise of the film sort of works like this, right? You have a bunch of different characters from all different walks of life. You have Xochitl, sort of the ringleader, and her best friend Theo. Both of them grew up in a refinery town in Southern California. And Theo has a rare form of leukemia that can be like contracted, I guess, living near a refinery town. Xochitl's mother dies in a freak heat wave in California, which is brought on by climate change. You have like the white noise of the news pop in and out and sort of stoke environmental catastrophism. Like all weather is climate change, right? Is basically sort of the premise of the film, at least in the background. And then you have these other characters like Sean, who is in college with Xochitl when she gets back from her mother's funeral, and they're doing like a divest campaign on campus. And both she and Sean are like, this is stupid. And this very arrogant white guy is like, well, it's a big system. Like, it's going to take a while to change. And they're basically like, fuck that. Like, we need to like take this into our own hands. And so they make a plot to find people to help them do this sabotage in Texas. And that means bringing in Theo so she can get revenge for the leukemia that she's had, which, by the way, she can't afford the meds too. So one of the things that's sort of like unclear is like why fossil fuels are the real villain and not like the healthcare system, considering there does seem to be like some course of treatment that she could ostensibly have access to. But that's never really brought up. One of the only critical voices of what they're about to do, this act of terrorism they're about to commit, is Theo's girlfriend, Alicia, who is a working class Black woman from LA that cleans houses. And then you have Logan and his girlfriend Rowan, and they're sort of like the punk white kids. And Rowan is something of a double agent. Spoiler alert, she is sort of the person that you're not sure if she's working for the FBI or not throughout the film. And then you have who I think is the most interesting character, which is Forrest Goodluck's character of Michael, who's indigenous, lives in the Dakotas, gets in fistfights with guys that are fracking there, and is just really, really angry and has like this unapologetic, nihilistic, violent streak. I should say that like Forrest Goodluck's performance is like head and shoulders above his peers. Had the film only been about that character, I probably wouldn't have written this review because it would have been an actually interesting film. But the emotional conceit of the film is that these people have been wounded in some way, and so now they get to do whatever they want, and you're supposed to cheer them on. And one of those things is blow up a pipeline. And the thing that's been so great for most film reviewers about this film is that it reviews its ethical conundrums like for you. They have like incredibly stilted dorm room bong rip debates about the merits of nonviolent or violent action, which are all like quickly like dismissed. It's sort of like those are just there for show so that you can sort of say you did them, and they don't bring up any real enduring tensions in the group. You know, nobody's made really uncomfortable. Like Alicia, who voices the most criticism and seems to be copped on, who's only there because she loves Theo so much, and who gets her leg shattered as they're trying to like tie a bomb to part of the pipeline. It seems to bring up like literally no tension between these people. So like emotionally, the movie doesn't make sense. It's really like the fossil fuel industry is evil. We need to get revenge. Laws don't matter because we're morally right. And we're going to do that. And we're going to do that because it's an act of self-defense against, and characters say this without irony and without any criticism in the film, billions will die if we don't start doing stuff like this. And then after it's all said and done, Theo and Xochitl successfully use Rowan to confuse the FBI in that it was just them and none of their friends, so all their friends get away, and they inspire, we find out, a bunch of other young people to start, I don't know, the first course of action for these people seems to be blowing up a yacht somewhere, and leaving a flyer.
It sounds like maybe it ends in kind of like a Fight Club, you know, pastiche.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's sort of, you know, and the thing is they leave this flyer behind that says, you know, it's like, why have destroyed your property? And it's basically like, you know, you're a climate criminal and the law won't punish you. So I have to.
Desperados. What do you call that again? That's not that.
So that's the film. Yeah. That's how to blow up a pipeline.
Okay. This is like it's interesting that these ideas are proliferating, that they're being endorsed by mainstream outlets. I mean, intellectual contagion is maybe the wrong way to put it, but you know, like I'm just a few things are coming to mind. I'm thinking of like the Anarchist Cookbook, which was maybe an FBI publication to help anarchists blow themselves up as they learn how to make bombs. I'm thinking of, you know, maybe this is drawing on the historical tradition of, you know, the Baader Meinhof gang in Germany, the Red Army faction, or in America, the Weather Underground.
Yeah, the Weather Underground. Yeah.
Can you help me like tie it into those movements and maybe some of the similarities and differences?
Yeah. So I think like, well, the similarities to the Weather Underground seem like pretty clear. Like, except for, you know, the
First of all, what is the Weather Underground for those?
So the Weather Underground was like basically a cadre of radical, white, wealthy, highly educated lefties who blew up a bunch of stuff in the 60s. I think one of them also blew themselves up.
And this was in response to the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War, yeah.
They did. I mean, they did, like. There's a movie about them. I watched it a number of years ago and thought it was amazing and was kind of inspired. And I was like, I want to be in the Weather Underground. I mean, there was some interesting stuff. Like they did reveal the Quintel Pro counterinsurgency kind of monitoring that was happening by like raiding an FBI office right in the middle of the night and like stealing all this papers. It was some kind of romantic adventurism type stuff. They caused a lot of property damage. I think Department of Defense infrastructure. The only person I think who died in a bombing, as you mentioned, was someone trying to make a bomb.
Blew themselves up in like the village in New York. Yeah, so
that bomb was intended to be placed at a dance of officers. So that one was going to be like the big violent one that was going to kill a bunch of people. Anyway, I'm not like swinging to the defense of the Weather Underground, but I do remember. And I'm trying to put myself, like if I watched how to bomb a pipeline, how to blow up a pipeline as a 18-year-old, if that, if I can transport myself in time from when I was 18 into this present moment, I'm not sure how I would have responded to it. Again, given how I responded to the Weather Underground film.
Yeah, well, I mean, it also helps that Fugazi does the soundtrack for that Weather Underground film, so it sounds great. Um, I mean, I'm very disenchanted by the Weather Underground for various reasons. I think they were also involved in the drafting of the Port Huron Statement, which is sort of like the manifesto for the new left and the pivot away from like a more typical class politics. And like what's his name? Mark Rudd, who finked on them to the FBI or was a double agent, lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he would come do talks at the bookstore I worked at in Santa Fe. And like that dude was a deluded egotist who screwed over his friends, even if I don't like his friends. Like I think he's basically a guy who got highly rewarded for having zero morals. And that's how I feel about most of these people, except for the Quintel Pro thing. Like blowing up a dance of officers is pretty disgusting as an act to do. And for some reason, they've just been given this free pass. And after, however many years, came back from living underground after all this stuff happened and walked into professorships at places like University of Chicago.
Yeah, yeah, almost all of them. It's extraordinary because I think they basically were outlaws, some of them for 15, 20 years at a time. I think when it was much easier to have fake identities.
Yeah.
I have
Oh,
no
for
idea
sure.
how this would work in our modern surveillance society. But I've met David Gilbert, who was, he kind of stayed underground and ended up being a getaway driver for a botched armed robbery. And now he's serving a life prison sentence in a US prison. I met him. Like it's interesting to have interacted with some of these people, but I think it's Bernadette Thorne and some of the other ones.
Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers, who I grew up around as a kid.
Yeah, they turned themselves in just before September 11th and basically got amnesty, I think.
Yeah, and interestingly, Bill Ayers' sister-in-law ran a daycare where Sheza Boudin worked that I went to as a kid.
And Sheza Boudin, again,
He was the DA in San Francisco that got thrown out for basically not doing his job.
Right. And,
Yeah.
like making it essentially unpunishable to steal like under $800 or something.
Yeah,
from
exactly.
outlets.
Something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah.
I don't know if it was
Anyway,
exactly him, or however that whole situation worked. But yes, he was thrown out by his own constituents for having a very soft on crime policy, in part because he spent his whole life with his parents in prison because they like killed a cop during a coke deal gone wrong and tried to throw their black friend under the bus for it. And for some reason, that's like this pitiable story that we're supposed to be like, oh, poor Sheza.
okay. So putting this Weather Underground thing aside, like there's a kind of context for what is the kind of terrorism that is being, I guess.
Yeah, then there's the Earth Liberation
fetishized.
Front in the 90s, which like Andreas Malm specifically invokes in his book. Like I know I'm being hard on these people, but that's because no one else is. Like that's sort of my frustration with this, is that this is like what's being endorsed in this movie is like way worse than what happened on January 6th in America. Like, and I don't like what happened on January 6th, but if people actually did this, it would be way worse. Like that seems like unequivocally true to me.
Okay, walk us through that thesis.
Yeah.
It may be obvious for you. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically what they're saying, what they do is they're like, we want to jack up the price of oil. They basically want to do the Malm plan. Like that's what they're going to do. I think that plan is stupid and it won't work because you can always buy oil from somewhere else that's willing to produce it. Like this makes zero sense as a plan. There are almost moments where they might get some workers killed or something like that, and they evade that scenario. But the likelihood that you could really do this without environmental damage or like all of these other things that they somehow find the solution to in the film seems very, very low. And again, like they bring it up for like a second. They're like, well, don't high oil prices like hurt poor people? And somebody just goes, revolutions are messy. And that's the end of that conversation, right? Like, and the point I bring up in the review is that in America, we have a tradition of what's called antinomianism. And I think it's a very like morally respectable and long tradition that comes out of Protestantism in America specifically. And it's the idea that there is a divine law of justice that is higher than the law of man. And you may not be freed from the law of man, but you are allowed to violate it in service of that higher good, right? So the two sort of canonical texts that come out of this movement are Henry David Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience and Martin Luther King's brilliant letter from Birmingham jail. And the difference between what's happening with these imagined terrorists and sort of MLK or Henry David Thoreau is that those guys believed in Christ. They believed in the redemption of the sacrifice of Christ. They had a whole horizon of human possibility and a belief, an enduring commitment, and the sanctity of the soul and the importance of justice and the polity that was informed by the idea of this divine law. What we have in How to Blow Up a Pipeline is what the very strange essayist Nick Land called in like 2007 transcendental miserableism. And it's the idea that the neo-Marxists on the left have basically given up on the idea of seizing the means of production and freeing them for even greater expansion of our abilities, and more or less resent capitalism for winning. Capitalism represents everything that they don't like. It represents alterations in what they think the timeline of history should be. And they're like, well, I didn't want growth anyway. I didn't want this anyway. The polar bears are dying and there's nothing that I can do, which eventually cankers over the years up until the present day into sort of a soft nihilism that's sort of like, it doesn't really matter if we're breaking the law. It doesn't really matter like if this plan isn't really even going to work because I feel terrible and this is in self-defense. Its main justification is if we don't stop using fossil fuels right now, billions will die. And we're doing this in self-defense. So it is an idea, it's an antinomianism that holds bare life, meaning reducing life to its biological facts, like can you eat, can you sleep, like all of these things. Bare life as both its justification and its horizon. I describe it as the political vision of insects. And I would say very, very different from the, I think, legitimate antinomian claims that men like Henry David Thoreau and Martin Luther King were making. And I juxtapose this antinomianism with a famous speech from a young Abraham Lincoln, his Lyceum address back when he was an Illinois House rep. And at the time, there was a lot of mob violence, a lot of lynchings, a lot of things like that. And what he said is, when you take the law into your own hands like that, when the mobocratic, as he calls it, sensibility prevails, it reduces people's faith in the law and demoralizes them, that the government by which we run our society and its constitution will have no friends or no friends strong enough to make sure that the system exists in perpetuity in a just way. And that the knock-on effects of this for society are incredibly high if you think that maintaining a republic is something worth doing. Now, it's clear that the characters in this book don't really, some of them are very honest about it. Like I said, the Michael character played very well by Forrest Goodluck. It's very clear. He doesn't want to rebuild anything. He just wants to destroy things. And he's not like, you can tell that there's something, he's very like broken inside. It's a very actually interesting character. In part because Forrest Goodluck is acting like way beyond his lines, unlike almost every single one of his other peers in that movie. But that's really it in the nutshell. And I say at the end of the review, what's disturbing about this, like, I don't think people are going to go out and commit these crimes because of this movie. I really don't. Like, I think, it won't be directly because of this movie. It will be because there's like an atmosphere of other things going on, right? Like, I saw some monkey wrenching go on in the Permian Basin that was not this extreme after Standing Rock. There were a lot of reasons why everybody was there, and it wasn't just because of the memes or the movies or whatever. Everybody had their own very highly complex, sort of nuanced reasons, even if it was wrong, to be there. So, what does worry me is that, there's this old anarchist idea called the propaganda of the deed, where the terroristic violence will shock the public into a revolutionary state, right? And this is sort of the propaganda of the deed. And right now in America, we have an uptick of assaults on energy infrastructure, which are being committed by neo-Nazis. And that's disturbing to me. It's disturbing to me that it seems to be like, at least up for debate on the left, that there might be some merits to that kind of strategy. Like the neo-Nazis are very clear. They want to demoralize society. They want to bring about a race war. You know, all the horrible things that you imagine they believe. And the left seems to want to demoralize society and bring about some sort of climate revolution or something. It's a little bit less clear. And they also want credit for feeling bad about it the whole time. And that seems to be the major difference, like in their hearts.
Very quickly, the neo-Nazis, are they the ones behind the like the grid substation attacks? And
yeah. So in Maryland, and I think in a couple other places.
And how significant is that as a phenomenon?
It's been increasing every year for the last couple of years. So it's becoming a more frequent impact on the grid. I mean, there were a lot of, I don't know there was a substation in the Southeast, I think in like Kentucky or Virginia or something like that. And I believe it was attacked, but I don't know by who. And it did leave people without their lights for a few days. And now there are all these debates about like, and especially in terms of cybersecurity as well, like what FERC is going to guarantee utilities get back for investing in grid security and stuff like that. So it's something people are talking about in the industry, right? Like that's how often it's happening. And so it's not like these things won't happen from the left. They could. I mean, I just don't like the sort of monocausal. To me, it would be sort of like saying that like the reason we don't build nuclear in America is because of the movie The China Syndrome.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. That would be and I'm like, that's like.
But building nuclear is a lot harder than sabotage, and I just think it's such a direct kind of call to action. There are a lot of desperate people. Like I was in New York with my girlfriend couple months ago, and this is the land where we actually were there to visit the Indian Point power station, which had been shut down the year before. And there was this group of well-intentioned young children with their Fridays for Future placards chanting, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, climate change has got to go," right? And the kind of naivety of political theory that's betrayed by that. And I mean, these are children, so I don't hold it against them, although they're being accompanied and sort of marshaled and shepherded along by these gray-haired, boomer
they have their
environmentalists.
Chaperones, right?
They have their chaperones. Yeah. But I mean, you can see why people are driven to more extreme action by just seeing the utter futility. I mean, that chant in and of itself, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, climate change has got to go." Like, obviously that's futile. And I think they're not being inspired by, I think, the messages that, frankly, folks like you and I and others in the nuclear advocacy community are after, which is this more constructive, pro-human, decoupling vision, however you want to put it, out there, right? They're not hearing those, or it doesn't fit into the sort of zeitgeist of their generation. I don't know. I can see this becoming a more significant source, particularly as we kind of head more into this nihilistic youth culture moment.
It could be. I just don't think, I think that there will be larger forces of which things like this movie and this book are a part. It is true. I know Janet Twenge has a book, I think that's her name, coming out called Generations, which does sort of like, she's very good at sort of breaking down the data about how different generations feel. And so she goes through all the way from the baby boomers to Zoomers about, I think that book comes out next month, about how they feel. And I've only looked at some press material and some early like snippets from it. But I mean, it is true that the generation right after me, the Zoomers, more or less does not believe that the American project is worth continuing. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. Some are the way in which this country has lost its luster, to say the least. I do frankly think that maybe this will be an unpopular thing to say on decouple, but I do think just like letting people riot in the streets for months for like no fucking reason is not a good thing for society to do frequently. But it's like, if you're, say, a middle-class family that owns a small business in like a downtown and it gets destroyed and you can't pay, like no one comes back to fix that, right? Like there's no accountability for that. And that's not the only thing that's going on. Like I said, like it's the purchasing power for Zoomers is going to be less than even for millennials. There are going to be a lot of external forces that massage people into a bleaker view that isn't entirely unjustified. And so, what's important about this movie is that it is irrigating a deep sense of despair and a complete lack of principle that seem to becoming more generalized in American culture. And that's what worries me most, because I think that has spillover effects into every other domain of society. You know, if we want to build things like nuclear, these projects take a while. You know, everyone kind of has to agree to them. And you basically have to say, like, I want this future to continue to exist in some sort of similar way for an extended period of time. Somebody who's like, I don't really care about this project. It's done nothing for me. It doesn't matter. It's all bullshit. Who cares? Isn't really going to endorse that type of long-term, hopeful strategizing and execution, you know?
What do you? I mean, again, I've been this morning just immersing myself, listening to Michael Malm interviews. It's very interesting, just the interviewers talking to him. These folks on the radical left, so-called climate thinkers, etc. And they have these very fantastical kind of conspiratorial ideas about why we're just not getting off fossil fuels. You know, for instance, that the Russian invasion provided this great opportunity for Europe to just keep pursuing wind and solar and replace that lost Russian gas. But instead, there's some kind of conspiracy going on that they're building LNG import facilities and signing contracts. Well, only one contract that's long term, et cetera. Right? Like, there's no appreciation
the conspiracy of keeping the lights on.
Yeah, I mean, there's no, as I think you introduced me to this term, there's just absolutely no engineering discipline guiding this. The main character's raison d'etre here is her mother or grandmother died in a heat wave. And
in California, by the way, which during the last heat wave, natural gas served 60% of electricity demand.
Air conditioning is kind of important in a heat wave. Yeah.
Yeah.
But okay, so I don't know if it's worth deep diving further, the kind of psychology behind the naive politics there. Maybe they just speak for themselves. I do want to, it's not, this is not about devil's advocacy here, but like I'm thinking about, acts of sabotage, which, I'd be more sympathetic towards. I'm thinking about, being in Central America and in like indigenous or rural agriculture communities that are fighting, a gold mine that's going to displace and pollute their territory, their agricultural, their means of production, their livelihoods. I'm very sympathetic to that, particularly with the ways in which, this often predatory mining companies are coming into jurisdictions with horrible labor and environmental standards and doing nasty things in people's backyards. I think it's very, very justified. There's examples like that. So how are those examples different from what is being advocated for, explored in this movie?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I would say that the most important thing that's happening in those countries is that there is the political contest is very, very clear. And it's trying to answer a question of who benefits. Right? And it's about people trying to defend their livelihoods and things like this. It is not a self-selected few who decide that they have the moral right based on bad science to commit terrorism in quote unquote self-defense. Right? So I think their argument doesn't really make sense on its face. If some major business, here's a great example, if some major business rolls into your farm community and says, we want to put down 7 square miles of solar panels on good farmland and steamrolls your town into it, which is happening, by the way. Robert Bryce just posted about this on LinkedIn. It's happened to a small community out in the Midwest. You get why people would want to commit sabotage or something like that. They are fighting for something that exists and is real and helps them put food on the table. These people are fighting for an abstraction that's incorrect. Like that, I think that's the biggest difference to me. Like somebody's like, I'm defending my job, I'm defending my community, I'm doing this. These people are like, we're defending the world. As I've said on here, anytime somebody says they're defending the world, immediately lower your estimation of their moral credibility. Immediately, whoever they are. They're going to be an insane person.
Is this like this faction of the left, and I think it's actually quite a large one, as you say. I mean, in terms of the responses to this film coming from mainstream outlets like New York Times. I'm not sure about the Ezra Klein situation. That would surprise me, but who knows? Excuse me. How do we as a society, or we as a group of thinkers, respond to this phenomenon? Do we try and speak to and win over this fringe environmental left? Do we try and sort of prevent that contagion working into a broader group of people, particularly young people, who are often ones who will fight for social causes, often in a very positive way? How do we deal with these kind of ideas and cultural manifestations of ideas, do you think? Because previously we said, okay, let's not even talk about Andreas Malm because he's irrelevant and he's an idiot. So clearly we are responding now. But how? What's the best way in your opinion?
Yeah, I think this is what keeps me up at night. This is literally what I journal about almost every other night before I go to bed. Is what to do about this sort of like morale crisis. And I was just on a podcast, The Realignment, where towards the end of it we talked about this. And I mean, first of all, I think one of the things that isn't necessarily helpful is to go around all the time and say like, wow, the Zoomers struggle to have a lot of faith in the future, or not all of them, but like a significant portion of them to the extent that it's like troubling us. Okay. And so don't at me on Twitter on this. But so we can go around all day seeing like, oh, what do we do? What do we do? Look at all the data. And that's fine. But it's like, what are we communicating to these kids about their country? Like, I'm a patriot, but that doesn't keep me from recognizing defects in American history, crimes, problems. It seems like there's this zero-sum game where you're either an insane jingoist or you despise the place that you're from. I don't really think a polity can continue to survive if no one believes in its core premises. That doesn't seem likely to me over an extended period of time. So I think there needs to be some sort of meaningful engagement and dialogue with kids as they're coming up about America and why they should want to be here. And I also think that from those of us who are older and are empowered, there needs to be more fight for a future worth living in. It's not like there's just this brain disease of people feeling sad and not liking the way things are that's going from carrier to carrier. It's also that people are responding to things that they see every day, and that's really important to address. So, but I don't know, right? Like, I don't talk to these kids. My wife does because she works with them, but not in a capacity where she's just like, and this is why civics is important, like that's not her job. So I don't totally know. I'm actually really at a loss because I've experienced such radical changes in my own internal life in regards to some of these questions over my 20s and now into my 30s, that it's almost like I don't have an account of what happened for me. I don't even know how to communicate that story. And so how would I know how to encourage these kids to change their minds? And certainly some of them might already agree with me. Some of them might be like, yeah, that stuff's weird. I don't like it. It bums me out. I want to do a totally different positive thing. And that's great. I'm sure there are plenty of kids like that out there. That's fantastic. So I also think that part of it should be like finding those kids and empowering them, because I think peer influence is really, really important. I think the more that they see themselves as helpless victims who are granted special status by their own sense of victimhood, the less likely they are to do anything salutary or productive for themselves or society.
Oh man,
Instead,
brother.
it will reduce politics to competitive fear-mongering in a war over the treasure box of the state for different identitarian and interest groups.
You got away with words, Emmett. Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I've talked about this a fair number of times, so I won't go on at length about it because my listeners will beat me over the head. But this preoccupation as a father now of a 4.5-year-old who still lives in like an incredibly non-toxic environment, where he doesn't, watches a little bit of cartoons and stuff, but like he's not plugged into, Jonathan Haid's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, is absolutely terrifying, talking about this iGen, the generation that grew up with an iPhone in their pocket, access to the internet and social media, from the age of puberty onwards, and what it's done, particularly to girls' mental health, et cetera, the cruelty of social media, the engineering of attention spans, et cetera. I mean, it's a pretty terrifying world we're entering into. And when that's grafted onto, the Greta Thunberg-inspired climate doomerism and nihilism and anxiety, I've said many times that the antidote to anxiety is empowerment. I had an interesting interview with Ted Nordhaus, which is back in the archives. We were actually talking about the Cold War and that sort of Sputnik-induced anxiety in America, which led to all these science clubs and rocketry clubs and this massive investment in education. Like, if I ran the world, and I was dealing with this kind of this situation of youth disengagement, like we do need that return to a sense of civics and civics duty, banding together around a common cause. And yeah, let's flood the education system with great educators and money to empower these kids to learn stuff, to say, hey, you're worried about the climate. Well, become an engineer, become a scientist, become this,
I think
that.
part of the problem there,
it's like this is like also Timothy O'Leary, like tune in, drop out, like that I'm seeing reverberating into the modern moment, and tuning in and dropping out is or blowing up pipeline are not ways that we're going to make a better world, a better country, a better society.
I mean, I think we also have some very gnarly selection effects in America that are happening too. Like the people who end up, a lot of them becoming teachers, are not the type of people that think that climate change is a technical problem that's solvable and that we're not standing on the brink of the apocalypse, right? Like that's a problem. That's a problem, like that is and I know that because the Chicago Teachers Union, when we were fighting to keep Byron and Dresden around, threw in with the Sierra Club and the NRDC against those nuclear plants. So the CTU is fine with destroying union jobs as long as they're not in Chicago, right?
Wow.
Like that's part of what's going on here. So we can't be asleep to that. Like that's a real problem. I don't know how to solve it, but you can't ignore it either. The other thing is like who ends up in the press? Who ends up, like, go look at the reviews for this movie. Almost all of them are positive. Or they're at least like, man, like maybe there's a point.
You're talking on the progressive side of the political spectrum, obviously.
Yeah, but I mean, like, who's done negative reviews? Like me and Kevin Kilo from Cowboy State Daily, compared to what? Like the New York Times, the Washington Post, like, New Republic or whatever. I mean, Kate Aronoff wisely said that she did not think that Malm's methods would work. And I appreciate someone from the left being very straightforward about that. But, like what's going on here? Right? If we see this as an information system that is supposed to deliver people something approximating the truth, right? It's a democracy that's going to be messy. It's pluralistic. There are going to be different ideas of that. But like there are some serious problems in the media in America that are highly negative and sometimes completely untrue assumptions about climate and about energy, and they are the biggest signals broadcasting those messages. So that's a problem too.
I think I'm asking myself the honest question and trying to empathize with why these mainstream progressive thinkers are giving this movie positive reviews and endorsing essentially Malm's theory of change to some degree or another, however lukewarm that is. And it's because I think there's so few alternatives. I mean, and what I find really interesting is this growing phenomenon. We've heard of climate solution denialists. That's usually leveraged against folks that are pro-nuclear or pro-fossil fuels or whatever. Or just very skeptical of renewables from an informed engineering discipline side of things. But now there's, we saw it break through with Planet of the Humans, the Jeff Gibbs film, which Michael Moore sort of gave his blessing to and therefore went ultra viral, where there's this real anxiety with, what's being promised by, the Jesse Jenkins, the clean tech community is this kind of utopia of, clean tech, which is going to just, not really have any backdoor issues or, stuff behind the on the kill floor behind the grocery shelves going on. And there's a growing, awareness. We've had Simon Michaud on the podcast several times. Not in love with his sort of thinking about the solutions, but a very, I think, informed person about the challenges of transition to what people are calling for. And there's this growing disillusion with that as well, which I think just fuels further nihilism. Like, what are the options on the table if it's either kind of degrowth or it's this bullshit clean tech utopia that's being offered, which is just inconsistent with material resource availability and physics. In some degree, I can empathize, I guess, with the kind of floundering in progressive communities and maybe falling into this as like, there's is it the worst of three choices of Malthusian nihilism, utopian thinking, or I don't know. I'm just trying
Well,
to.
so I think, yeah. So I think part of what's happening is that like there's a profound sense of meaninglessness about life, and thinking the world's going to end solves that problem. I think that it's about that simple, right? If there are existential stakes, you feel like empowered, you know what you need to do. And that's what I think is going on there, and there are a lot of complex reasons why it has ended up being this sort of message. Some of it's ideological path dependency, all sorts of things. But I think that that's what's going on. And that's a at-scale problem. It's very difficult to solve. I would also say that, like, sort of the problem with a lot of people like me, if I can be self-critical, is that we're fucking nerds. There's a public image problem, right? Like, I'm not a nice guy. Like, that's a big problem for this, right? Like, I think so. Like, that's a limitation that I have as a person, right? So we need better ambassadors for our ideas. And another thing that I think all of us need to stop doing is bitching about hypocrisy. That is like the worst thing you can do if you're in our position. I used to not think that, now I do. And let me tell you why. All you do when you say, oh, well, this person doesn't abide by their own rules, the implicit message there is, I'm weak and they're powerful. And that's the story.
What's the concrete example of that
Just
abstraction?
Just
give us a couple.
Al Gore wants us to reduce our carbon footprints, but he flies 80 planes a day or whatever. Right. I've said this, and stuff like that. All that tells me, what people need to understand is that it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. And so when you say, oh, that's hypocrisy, what you're actually saying, broadcasting to everybody, is there's a hierarchy and I'm not at the top. It's a waste of time. And all it does is entrench your inferior status and then make you feel resentful, which is like drinking poison, hoping that the other guy's going to die. Totally unconstructive. Like, that has to stop. Also, it makes you look like a loser, and no one wants to hang out with losers. Like, I'm breaking my own heart here. Like, people can go back to some stuff I've written and see that I make this plain, right? But I'm actually criticizing myself here. It's something that over the past 2 years, I've really done some soul searching on, and I think it has to end.
I guess to close up, Emmett, what's your prescription? And obviously, we're building it, right? We're constructing it. We're part of a movement. I think, however loosely affiliated that is, in terms of a group of thinkers and content creators, if you want to kind of take on that modern label. What do you see emerging? What sort of tendencies do you see growing? I mean, in terms of the alternative to what's being offered up by this film to our generation and to those generations coming. I know that's a huge abstract question with tons to unpack there, but I'm just trying to evoke some kind of a positive path forward.
I mean, so I just recorded a great conversation with Alex Trembath for Nuclear Barbarians that I think should be coming out next week. One of the things that he talked about, which I thought was kind of inspiring, is that one of the things that we might want to pay attention to and maybe even rely on going forward are the internal contradictions in the environmental ideology. All this renewable stuff began as a small scale dream, but now that it's trying to be built out at a large scale, it will become clear that it's untenable. That's just going to happen. So being there on deck with a positive message as that whole thing falls apart is going to be very, very important. Alex also, I think, made a great case that sort of breakthroughvian thought that's a little more positive is slowly gaining ground against these environmental orgs. And as you've seen in Canada, it is possible to flip people. Like, I'm glad also in America that Gavin Newsom wants to run for president. And he's like, I can't shut down Diablo Canyon, and San Francisco can't look like a demilitarized zone. You know, like that can't happen for me. You want your politician's selfish ambition to be in line with the public good. And that's what's happening. Could it have happened sooner and better? Yes. Is Gavin rewarding himself for letting a hostage go? Yes. But who cares if it keeps the plant on? Same thing with Jennifer Granholm and Palisades in Michigan. If that plant wasn't in Michigan where she was governor, I don't think the DOE would be trying as hard to help Holtec save it. And we should be thankful for that, you know? And so I think focusing on our wins is hugely important. Every time we get a dub, we should be like, you know, strapping 50 megaphones together and screaming to our neighbors about it. You know, like that is really, really important. And so I think that as these things get messier, as their internal contradictions start to split them apart, sort of standing astride the tumult of history and offering a new way forward is going to be incredibly inspiring for the people that want to be inspired. And it won't be everyone, right? But it just needs to be enough. I don't really like that creepy minoritarian stuff that like Paul Ehrlich, you know, where they're just like, we just need 5% of people, because I think that there's something like gross and conspiratorial about that and like anti-democratic. Like, but you do need just the critical mass, you know, to change things. And that is really, really important. The other way I look at it is this. If they can win, so can we. The Green Movement is looking at corporate America and the war machine and the utility industry in the 60s and 70s and watching it and its core premises and its legitimacy fall apart in front of their very eyes. And they're already there with their message. They're motivated, and they're going to start changing things. What happened back then is starting to happen to them now, and we can be a part of how that changes. And so I'm not a doomer, right? Like I am on board for the American project. I love this country. I think that we can change it for the better. I think it can even be bipartisan, which is really important. I think we're already getting glimpses that for nuclear, that's already going to happen and will continue to happen. And I hope it does, because that is vital. And that's where I'm at.
I mean, I have to say, you know, on the Canadian front, it's just amazing watching the anti-nuclear lobby fall like a house of cards. It is a boomer phenomenon, bereft of optimism and hope and faith in humanity.
Yeah.
I just debated sort of the emblematic leader of the kind of Canada's anti-nuclear movement. He's been at this for 48 years. He's an 83-year-old man. You know, hats off to him. Incredible stamina. You know, quite an intelligent guy, particularly given his age. But the sun is setting on those folks, and it's been just absolutely incredible. I mean, you know, I confronted Canada's Minister of Environment and Climate Change, a former Greenpeace activist who, in a stunt, rappelled off of the CN Tower, at that time the world's tallest tower. I think it was around a climate change issue. A staunch anti-nuclear activist, confronted him in Glasgow at COP26 2.5 years ago, and he just ate humble pie and endorsed nuclear to save his job. I mean, this guy's got no principles. But as you say, we got to celebrate those kind of things.
Hey, look, you see one of those people with no principles, what you should say to yourself is, their principles should be mine. And that is possible with someone without any.
All right, Emmett. We'll leave it there, Matt. It's been a blast. And yes, I will see you in person in 3 dimensions in San Francisco very shortly at the Breakthrough Dialogues. One more shout out to Nuclear Barbarians, to Grid Brief. That is, I think, one of the most undersubscribed. You know, the ratio between quality and subscription is way off there, so everybody should stop listening right now and
fix
sign
that
up for that.
People.
And Emmett, you did a great job with being the hype man on the intro, so I'm going to let you do the outro here. Take it away, whatever you feel like.
Hey, look, you know, I talk smack, I talk a big game. I get that I might say things that people might not like on here. That's fine. You don't have to completely agree with me, and I don't have to completely agree with you to agree on what the solutions are. And that's the most important thing. I hope things that I said here were provocative and helpful for people, and I hope that you continue to subscribe and listen to Decouple. There we go.
What about the stay radiant, stay classy stuff?
Oh,
That's what
yeah.
I'm looking for.
Stay strong, stay sharp, and stay radiant, folks. We will see you next time.
Love it. Bye for now.